Welcome to the Establish the Edge podcast. I'm your host, Mike Leone, bringing you the first of a recurring show that I'm going to do once a week on Tuesdays or Wednesdays for the rest of the offseason and throughout the in-season NFL year. It's the nerdy version of the solo podcast. I'm going to tackle some high-level macro concepts. So not going to be saying like, who's the best fifth round value at wide receiver. That's not the type of content I'll be doing. It'll be kind of like higher level in season, might do a little bit of DFS recap and then talk about like how you should construct rosters for certain tournaments, things of that nature. We'll also be glad to take listener questions. You can tag me on X at 2hats1mike or on the Establish the Run Discord. Today's topic is going to be home league auction strategy. For both keeper leagues and non-keeper leagues. Before I dive into that, do want to note we have some very good auction content on the Establish the Run site for the Draft Kit subscribers. Jack Miller's got some targets for cheap players that you can read. There's some strategy pieces up there and videos from Jack Hahn, Chris Eibel, to higher stakes players that are much more experienced and better than me at auctions, and you should really listen to them, especially if you're going to be doing like FFPC, NFFC auctions, that type of thing. We also have our auction values for different formats on site. I'm going to be speaking more to home league auctions on this podcast, and the best way to attack them. And auction leagues are an incredible amount of fun. I think there's this notion that I've had in the past that like I should dominate the auction league, right? Because I have much more control over what I'm doing. I'm not stuck with a specific draft slot. If I think Jamar Chase is way better than every other player and I pick third, I can't get him in a snake draft because he's going first. If I'm in an auction, I can bid and get him. Every player is at your disposal. What I found in reality is it's not that simple. Your edge might be higher in an auction, but it might be a little bit more difficult and tricky to actually have that edge come to fruition. And there's a couple mistakes I've made that I want to talk about in auctions and why I think they're mistakes before I get into how I currently attack auctions. The first mistake is being too focused on player values, and the second mistake is not adjusting enough for league dynamics. In terms of player values, what I mean here is I don't think the best way to win an auction is to just say, print out the ETR auction values, go into your auction, try and get every player at a price below what the ETR auction value is at, and ignore every player that goes above what the ETR auction price is at. I don't think that is going to work. That might sound a little counterintuitive given that if you followed my content at all for best ball, I am very much about player values in best ball, getting ADP value. There's some key differences, though, between best ball and auction that I think are worth discussing and why my stance is different. In best ball, you can, first of all, that market's a lot sharper. I guess I'll start there. I think the best ball ADP market's a lot sharper. There's less volatility in terms of when a player is nominated, things like that. And at each pick, you have to make a pick, right? If I have a pick in the middle of the third round, it doesn't matter if I don't really like the players. I have to make a pick. And what I pick in the third round might influence what's available to me in the fourth round. So that linear nature sort of plays into ADP value being more important. If I think in the end of the fourth round, I like George Pickens and Jalen Waddle. George Pickens goes earlier than Jalen Waddle. Even though I actually like Waddle a little bit more, I might take George Pickens knowing I can get Waddle in round 5. You don't have that dynamic exactly in best ball because once a player is nominated, they're off the board. They're going to a team. Who you choose to abstain from is not impacting who's going to be available later in the league. There's also, between best ball scoring and the deeper rosters, there's a lot more players that are viable in best ball, right? Players, maybe some of these running backs that have shaky long-term upside, but really strong out of the gate roles, they can be more viable in best ball when you can kind of shape your RB room based on the best ball scoring to take advantage of that. It's also important to note that in most of these best ball leagues, 2 out of 12 teams are advancing out of the regular season. So having a good team right out of the gate has a bit more value than in a typical redraft league where, let's say, like 4 out of 12, 6 out of 12 teams are making the playoffs. That bar is a little bit lower. With that bar being lower, we can focus more on having these, hopefully, teams that are superstar teams by the end of the year. And of course, waivers comes in to play in a big way in best ball. And it's going to change the way we do things, knowing that at the running back position, for example, all year long, we're going to be able to make 10, 20, 30, maybe even different bets on these handcuff type running backs that could emerge and see a big role. Whereas on your best ball roster, taking 5 or 6 running backs, only maybe 2 or 3 of them are late, and you're stuck with those bets for the whole season. So it is very different. And as a result, I think the ADP value side of things matters a little bit less. You're not, again, going to win your league simply because you have a list of values that are better than your league mates' values. It's going to take a lot more thought, and you need to be just more mindful of how you're spending your money, not just that you're getting a value. I know in the past, like I said, I've gone into leagues just saying, hey, my sheet says Bijan Robinson 55. He's at 53. I have to bid. That's not the way that it works. Some other notes, differences, not just between best ball, but between your typical redraft, snake draft, and an auction league. I think in snake drafts, sometimes that week 1 starting lineup can be overrated. We might get into a situation in a snake in round 8 where you feel like, oh, I filled out my starting skill spots. Let me take my quarterback now in round 8 just to fill out that week 1 starting roster. I want that roster to look good. Or I filled out, my 3 wide receivers in my flex. Let me get my RB2 here. I don't want to look weak at RB2. I want this really good week 1 starting lineup. When clearly the best pick there is maybe another wide receiver for your bench or something of that nature. In snakes, people can be overly concerned with that week 1 starting roster. I think it can work the opposite way in auctions, especially if you're a value hunter, or where you could end up 2 studs and duds because you thought all the top players were going for too cheap. But you're extremely fragile with the rest of your starting lineup. And not only that, but now the stashes that you're making on your bench, they're inferior stashes because you don't have money to get the right upside plays. That can really be suboptimal in an auction. It can swing the other way too. And this is where I'm guilty a lot because sometimes we'll talk about being patient in auctions, which is important. But if you find, the best segment of players that are undervalued is like these rounds 4 through 8 picks, and you just end up with a ton of them on your roster, there's probably going to be other teams that have more stud power than you at a couple of positions, and they're able to navigate their bench better because they've got a couple of cheap spots where they can get stashes, they can rotate through the wire, whereas you've got this super balanced lineup, but it's not obvious who to start necessarily, and it's not putting you a spot where you can churn over the waiver wire with a couple of your bench spots, because rather than your last 2 to 3 bench spots being $1 to $3 players, they're $10 players that you thought should have gone for 15. And that's where you start to see like, hey, you might draft a team that on paper in a $200 auction budget league is worth $220, and your league mates are drafting a lot of teams that are only worth $180, and you think, hell, my team is $40 better than all these other teams. I'm going to win. But how that $40 gets utilized on your roster is really what's most important. If you bring that number down to 20, and it's really well spent and spread out in the correct ways, that is much better than having $40 of excess value that's not even really usable or adding to your team. The other mistake I talked about making, league dynamics. Something I've come around to lately. I think that in auctions, you might end up in a situation where someone whose player values are worse on paper, but much more calibrated to what the actual players will go for in their draft, is at a better advantage than someone whose player values on paper are absolutely perfect, but they're completely disassociated for how that particular league is going to value players. And that might seem odd. You kind of want to zig when everybody zags, especially if you're right and the market is wrong. But I think there's a Goldilocks thing here where you don't want to do that too little, where you're not taking advantage of, your player analysis edge, but you don't want to do it too much where you're so detached from the market that you end up with a roster that doesn't make a ton of sense. I always go to 2 quarterback snake leagues, and I think it's analogous, even though it's a snake draft example. But 2 quarterback leagues can have very different ways in which the league chooses to value the quarterback position. In some of those leagues, the quarterbacks just go like that. They go crazy. If you don't have 2 through 3 rounds, you might be in a ton of trouble. In those leagues, if you say, hey, the league's overvaluing quarterbacks, I'm gonna wait it out and not take any, and you don't realize that your league mates aren't gonna stop taking quarterbacks, and you get totally boxed out, it might not matter if your quarterback value, analysis was 100% right. If you're totally boxed out of the position, you might have a tough time winning that league, even picking up better skill players. The flip side, if you think your league's like, wow, these people don't realize the positional scarcity in a 2 quarterback league, they're taking quarterbacks way too late, I'm going to take 2 right away. What can happen there is, yes, you end up with 2 very good quarterbacks on your team, and the rest of the league is undervaluing it. But if they're all undervaluing it, there's going to be a few other teams that still get 2 pretty darn good quarterbacks that were able to draft much better skill players than you early, because you were the first person to jump in on the quarterbacks. And there's also an opportunity cost, right? Like, yeah, you took a quarterback in round 2 that was clearly the right pick, but the whole league's undervaluing it. In round 5, maybe there's an amazing quarterback value. Now you're boxed out of taking that value. So again, that's another situation. Either way, if you're too detached from what the market is doing, even if the market's wrong, you can end up with a suboptimal team. And we do see that in auctions where, let's say, you've got all these 4th round wide receivers undervalued by 20%, and every top running back overvalued by 20%, and you stick to your values exactly, and you draft a team and you're like, wow, I've got 7 really great values at wide receiver. Well, depending on how many wide receivers your league starts, that might not necessarily be a good thing. I mean, you probably want 5 or 6 to fill your flex and have room for breakouts and whatnot. But you start getting to like 7 or 8, now you've gotten values on that 7th and 8th wide receiver, but it's not helping you. Meanwhile, you've just kind of waived every top running back. There's going to be other teams that are designed more optimally than you, even if they eked out less value from their players. So that was a little bit of a rough example, but I hope it kind of makes sense. And in terms of what you should do, rather than arbitrarily trying to pick up $1 to $2 of value early on every single player you can, I think you want a specific roster construction plan. And I think you should let previous years in that league help you to form that plan. You want to take your quote unquote perfect values, slide them 50% of the way towards where you think players will actually go. And I think if you head into the draft with values of, or you can even have 2 columns, one column is the ETR values, or what you think players should be valued at, and the other columns where you think players are going to actually be drafted at. That bit of information is every bit as useful where players actually be drafted at, maybe more useful than where you think the players should be drafted at in terms of values. So I think that's one thing you want to do to adjust for the league dynamics. Another thing is to track inflation throughout the draft. So let's say you've got a 3rd column now that's sort of some sort of weighted average of where you think the players are actually going to go in dollar cost, and where you think they should go in dollar cost. This 3rd column, some sort of weighted average of the two. What you can do, you can make a simple spreadsheet to track in draft, like, hey, I think Bijan Robinson is $53. Someone spent $65 on him. That's $12 over spent by the league. So if it's a $200 auction league and there's 12 teams, there's $2,400 of money available to be spent on all these players. You can then look at the excess money that is either available if players are going for too cheap, or unavailable if players are going too expensive, and then start on a percentage basis, take that cost away from all the remaining players in your draft. And I think that's important because it really helps you visualize as a draft is going on where the other players might start to go. If all the studs are going for $10 too much, and then you make this inflation adjustment, you're going to start to see the mid-tier players drop in terms of what they should go for. Now DJ Moore comes up, and you've originally got him at $18, and he's up for 16, and you're thinking, oh, I have to take this value. Well, the inflation adjustment now, based on what's already happened in the auction, it might have them down to $14. So you're actually not getting the value you think you are. There's going to be better values later on if you wait it out. So I think tracking that inflation is really important. You can also, in keeper leagues, do this ahead of time with all the keepers put in. And keeper leagues in particular, I think you can throw trying to get value out the window. You're going to end up with teams that have very specific goals and are willing to do whatever it takes to achieve their goals. And I don't think that's wrong, because if you have three amazing running back values because you had Bijan Robinson as a rookie and have just kept him, and whatever it is, you might do whatever it takes to get the top tight end available in the auction, because that's going to give you the best team possible, even though it's not quote unquote value. So in terms of roster construction, when we look at where we think players should go, where we think they're actually going to go, generally you'll notice pockets of value. And your goal then is to design a roster ahead of time going into the draft that takes advantage of where these pockets of value are going to be. And it doesn't have to be specific players, but it might be a group of players or an archetype of players that you know you want. So let's say you got that group of fourth round wide receivers that's undervalued. You can kind of pre-build in a really simple spreadsheet what the best version of a team looks like that takes advantage of those players. You can group them, and now you can play the value game within that group. So not only do you have a group of receivers that you think is undervalued, but within that group, you can make sure, or do your best at least, to get the best possible value. So let's say, just for example, we look at wide receivers in our table and we say, this group of players from DJ Moore through, Jamison Williams, we have them from $21 to $24. We based historically on the draft, we know these players are actually going to go probably low 20s, high teens, and a couple of them are going to squeeze down low. So I'll kind of make in my spreadsheet, okay, how many of these players do I even want? That's important. Because like I said earlier, example, if you just blindly get all these values, it might not fit. But let's say, hey, I'm okay with these guys being my starting three wide receivers. I can have a couple on the bench. Between them, I know a few are going to emerge as clear starters. The rest are going to give me depth pieces. So you pencil that into your spreadsheet, like outlining your roster, just give every roster spot and just say, hey, round 4 wide receiver here, round 4 wide receiver there. Now you see how much money that you have left working with after you've taken advantage of these values. And you might go, okay, based on those values, I've got the room to spend on an elite running back. And I've got X amount of money that I can spend on an elite running back now. That kind of frees you up then going into the draft. Your goal, those elite running backs, while it's non-linear in an auction in terms of who gets nominated, a lot of times those are the players that are going to get nominated first. So knowing that in order to absolutely optimize this pocket of round 4 wide receivers that you're getting values on, you really need one elite running back. You need to do a hero RB build. You can then play the value game within those elite running backs. You don't have to overpay on Saquon Barkley by $10. But you're okay just saying, hey, if I can get one of these backs roughly around where I think they should go, a couple dollars less, amazing. A couple of dollars more, that's okay. This is how going to give me the best roster. I'll readjust everything afterwards. I think that frees you up to have the best draft possible. Another example of this, I think QB 12 to 22 is deep this year. In a typical redraft snake draft, might not be the best way to take advantage of that, right? Because the way the snake draft works, getting this amazing value on, let's say, CJ Stroud in round 15 of a 1 QB snake draft, while in a vacuum that might be a great value, it's not like I'm getting an extra third round pick out of it. Yes, I've taken all skill players earlier and been able to build up better skill players than the rest of the rosters. It's not the same as in an auction going, hey, I can be patient in QB 12 to 22, get one of these QBs for extra cheap. Now I actually have extra money that I didn't apply to the quarterback situation. And my round 2 player becomes a round 1 player, or my round 5 player becomes a round 3 player. So the ability to spend that extra money, I actually think it frees you up to take advantage of more values than maybe you can in a snake draft. Whereas I'm in a snake draft, I'm going to be like, oh, CJ Stroud's a great value, but it's not going to actually help me win. You can kind of contrive things in an auction to really maximize, the value that you're squeezing out of it. So I think it's important to adapt your plan live. Like, don't just, pre-plan draft and then go, okay, I've got this pre-planned draft. Now I'm going to just track, the actual prices of players. You kind of want to do a hybrid approach. So I mentioned outlining very simple spreadsheet. Maybe it's like QB 12 to 22 cheap, $1 you're allocating. RB1 spot, elite RB, $60. RB2 spot, maybe it's just like a Tony Pollard, one of these like cheap starting running backs I want. Like, I just want a usable running back out of the gate. I know I can get one for cheap. Have that cluster of players that you think are viable there. Wide receivers 1 through 3 and flex 1 is, these rounds 3 to 5 wide receivers we think are undervalued as a group that we're going to continue to hit. Tight end, maybe you've got enough money you've got a mid-tier tight end, you could dabble in elite. Now you've got this set up, all of a sudden, maybe you get a really good value on that hero RB, that elite RB you're going for. Or maybe you switch it up, you get a really good value, and it's like, Josh Jacobs just went way too cheap. I made him my elite RB when I planned on it being Saquon or Gibbs. Now we adjust that tight end spot from a mid-tier tight end to an elite tight end live in the draft. And you just keep morphing things that's going to give you the best possible roster. You want to know when you have that excess money where it's going. You want to know right away so that you don't make a mistake. And then the bench approach is really, really important here as well. Some notes on the bench. One, make sure you spend all your money. The worst thing you can do in auction is not spend all your money. So make sure you spend all your money, and it's better to have less money later than more money later. As far as the bench goes, I think you want, let's say you've got a 5 to 6 person. I think 6 is like pretty standard for a bench in a redraft league. So you've got a 6-person bench. You want 2 to 3 of those spots to be, I think, like 0 running back type bets that you're willing to churn the roster over. You don't want to be saying, hey, Jerry Jeudy in underdogs, this amazing value, and now I can get him for $6 in an auction. That seems incredible, and he's your last piece. And it's like, if you're not starting him and he's not really helping you, you've already got 6 better wide receivers, and now you're afraid to churn that roster spot to take some of the best RB stashes that come up. Like, that's a problem. So, and that's at the point where you're like, well, as good of a value as like, a $6 Jeudy and a $12 Olave was, if I just combine that into one player that's a Jalen Waddle, who's a much better player, and I have a bench stash, that's a better way to spend my money. It might on paper be, less auction dollars theoretically added up going Waddle and a $1 RB bench stash than Olave plus Judy. But in terms of how it actually helps you win, it might be much, much more valuable. So that's important. Some other kind of random notes. I hope this makes sense to you about, I know it's kind of like, super simplistic, essentially what I'm getting at, which is like, hey, I'll pre-plan your roster and like outline the players you want. But I actually think there's some wisdom in that simplicity in terms of like, hey, this is the type of roster I can get based on the market values that's going to give me the best chance to win, and then kind of make it happen. And that's where you value hunt from there, as opposed to like, hey, I'm just going to randomly get players at really good values and just let it shake out and have a team that has a ton of value. And then that team just doesn't make a whole ton of sense. Some other random auction notes that I want to make. Careful of getting the last guy in a tier. If you're in a super flex league and there's 6 elite quarterbacks, if you wait for the 6 because you don't love the value in the first 5, usually that 6 goes for way more. The rest of the league sees the last person in a tier. You're not sneaking it by anybody. So if you can, try to avoid getting the last player in an obvious tier, especially in keeper auction leagues. This happens. You're not sneaking that by anybody else. And to that point, sometimes if you're going after elite players out of the gate, honestly, first player, second, third player, when people are kind of feeling things out, sometimes can be the best time to get that player before people realize there's not enough people for me to spend my money on. So make sure you're cognizant of that. At the same time, based on how your roster is shaking out, there might be a point where a player's last in a tier and you just got to spend on that player and get that player. Overpaying for $5, $6, $10 even might make your team better than if you don't. And I think there's times where you have to be disciplined, focused, and just suck it up. And just say, taking this player makes my roster better. In terms of staying focused and disciplined, the opposite can be true with values late. You just gonna have to be a little bit stoic and accept there's gonna be some values out there that you want to jump on, but you can't because of the players you've already taken. Everything you're doing in an auction should be to make your team as good as possible. And I don't think, as a result, I don't think you really want to do much price enforcing in an auction. Let the rest of your league price enforce. Never bid on a player unless you actually want that player at that price. Be focused on your team and make your team as strong as possible. Now, if you're in a long-running local league, you might know how you can push some of your league mates. And, certainly you want to put that knowledge to the best use possible. So I wouldn't say never price enforce, but just, be pretty confident in what you're doing when you do the price enforcing. As far as bench stashes too, get the stashes that have the potential to help your team the most. So, this example I went through was a hero RB team with maybe like a shaky RB2 that's like usable volume out of the gate, give you that good week 1 starting lineup. And then you've built a ton of depth at wide receiver with these mid-round wide receiver values. Your stashes there have to be 0 RB candidate guys, right? They have to be Jaden Blue types, right? You cannot get distracted and say, oh my God, Luther Burden, late breakout wide receiver is only $1. If you want to take advantage of a cheap Luther Burden, you should have structured your draft plan differently. You need to focus on what's actually going to move the needle for your team the most. I remember a keeper league a handful of years ago. It's like, wow, I got Rondale Moore and Terrace Marshall for $1. I'm holding these guys all season long. And I think when we go, especially from best ball to redraft or auction, we overrate the likelihood these players actually are going to matter. And these guys were never startable. They never broke out. They weren't keepers. They clogged my roster because I was afraid to drop them. So you want to stay on task and really understand what the target variable here is that you're optimizing for. Cool. I think that is it. Again, I do want to reiterate, you don't want to be too balanced, and understand a lot of times the thing about being patient, you want the right amount of patience in a draft. There's always going to be a few players late that really slip through the cracks. If you can pre-identify, again, what position and range of players that's going to be, you put yourself in a position to take advantage of that later by not overfilling spots early. At the same time, you really want to make sure you spend your money early. And spending more money early kind of actually forces you to get the best of those values. So an example of a recent draft I did, spent a lot of my money early, got Jawan Jennings as my final wide receiver for $1. I had to bypass some $11, $12 values at wide receiver that appeared earlier in the draft. And I was kind of partly forced to do that, bypass those receivers. I had spent so much money already, but I kind of knew of this group in, these 6th, 7th round receivers. There's going to be a point in the draft where everyone's really nervous about overfilling spots. They've realized they only have so many spots left, or they have to save their money for a certain thing. So you do want to be patient. Just understand that if you're overly patient, it can lead to overly balanced lineups that aren't really helping you to actually win. So find the right amount of patience. All right, a lot of rambling on the auction strategy. I hope this was useful and made sense. Again, feel free to tag me on X at 2hats1mike or in the Established to Run Discord if you have any questions about this episode or questions you'd like me to address on future episodes. I'm happy to listen and to respond to that. Appreciate everybody tuning in. Best of luck in your drafts this offseason.